And Victor was asking on the way about when Schelling talked about the Catholic Shakespeare. We'll come to that, but let's come to that right now, because that's the question. Where is Shakespeare studying? Sorry, Shakespeare. Hamlet, where is Hamlet studying? He's in Wittenberg, right? Now known as Lutherstadt, Wittenberg, right? Because Luther was there. Right? Is it still Lutherstadt, or was that the old East German? Lutherstadt. You know, is that a coincidence that Hamlet is studying in Luthertown? He's in Lutherville. And when we meet Hamlet at the beginning of the play, he's sort of, oh God, you know, I hate myself. His only desire, the only desire he expresses in the play, really, the only desire that he expresses as his own desire is to go back to Wittenberg. He's got no friends in Elsinore, in Denmark. The only friends he has seem to be friends, student friends. He's a rather old student as well. Shouldn't forget that. You know, there's one reference, the Yorick scene, where he says, alas, poor Yorick, 23 years ago he bore me upon his shoulders. I mean, the Hamlet is in his late 20s. You know, he's a rather aging student by Elizabethan standards, right? People were going to university when they were 15, 16 back in those days. So you wonder what he's doing hanging around in Wittenberg. But he's studying, apparently, and he's got a very close relationship with Horatio, which we can begin to wonder about for all sorts of reasons. He seems to really like Horatio. And the point being of this, that Hamlet is divided within himself. He's in the grip of indecision. He cannot decide what to do. He knows what he should do. He should avenge his father's murder, but he can't do that. He can't bring himself to act. So somehow, for Hegel, Hamlet is the paradigm of the modern subject. Right? The modern subject who is divided against themselves. This is what self-consciousness has become for us. So if the division, within ancient tragedy is division at the heart of substance, which is Antigone and Creon, the division is division within subjectivity, between, so self-consciousness is an experience of self-alienation. Where the subject experiences itself as alienated from itself, alienated from the world, right? And divided into two. And if you get into Hegel, he elaborates this in relationship to another crucial text for Hegel, which is Ramos Nephew by Diderot. And in Diderot's Ramos Nephew, which would be really good to do here at some point, he talks that there are two characters in Ramos Nephew, the I and the he. The point being is that there's no subjectivity is radically divided against itself. And we're incapable of decision, we're incapable of action in the world. And that's our tragedy. Right? And the world of fate, the role of fate in the ancient world has disappeared and simply become a world of crime. Right? It's not fate decreeing murder and death in Macbeth. Hegel says Macbeth's acts are criminal acts. Right? He says, and what does Hamlet do? Hamlet knows what he should do and can't do it. And he has every opportunity to kill his uncle as I said the other day, then comes up with this bizarre idea of constructing a play within the play that will be the thing that will catch the conscience of the king. And it works. It works. It's brilliant. The king leaves the theatre, the usurper king leaves the theatre, and we find him alone, the only time in the play, I believe, alone, saying, "Oh, my crimes are so awful. It's, you know, my words do not go to heaven. I am." You know, he admits his guilt, right? And then Hamlet comes in with a fucking sword. Right? He could do him then, right? It's worked. And Hamlet hesitates and says, "Oh, now this would be the wrong moment because he's praying. Right? If he's praying, then it means his soul's going to go to heaven, and that would be the wrong time. I should get him. No, I'll get him when he's in bed with my mother, or when he's drunk, or when he's angry, and then I'll get him." He slips his sword back in the sheath and goes off to see his mother, right? Saying, it's amazing, he goes, "Mother, mother, 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 mother," and he rages at his mother. So he can't kill him. And the final scene of, and then what does he do when he gets in his mother's room? There's Polonius, who's, as usual, idiot that he is, you know, conniving with Gertrude, with other people. He slips behind the carpet, the arras. Hamlet hears something, lunges with his sword, and then says, "Is it the king?" But he knows, he's just left the king 30 seconds earlier. It can't be the king. It's something. So he can, and then the final scene with the switch of rapiers, the final scene of Hamlet. He's been hit with a poisoned rapier. He knows he's dying. And if you look at the moment when he finally kills the king, it's a moment of sort of spontaneous willfulness. There's no reflection involved. What's the point of all this? Is that the reflection does not lead to action in modern subjectivity. The only action we're capable of is an action which is, as it were, without any forethought. And the minute that reflection kicks in, we're lost. And for Hegel, this becomes a parable for modern subjectivity. There's no reconciliation in modern tragedy. The reconciliation that there is a kind of fake reconciliation, which if you think through Shakespeare, I think is how I'd read the end of all the great tragedies. Right? You've got a stage full of bodies, and then, you know, on comes a king, Fortinbras comes in, or Edgar comes on stage, and well, you know, that's the end of the play, and we must learn something from it, and good night. You know, it's a fake reconciliation, very important. You know, and if we give any credit to whatever that writing collective in South London called Shakespeare was, because who knows what Shakespeare was, then it must have been somehow, the effects must have been known. I could talk about comedy, modern comedy, but I won't. That is Hegel, more or less. The question is, how do you put together this self-alienated self-consciousness with substance? Right? That's the question that Hegel leaves us with. And you could basically, you know, if you wanted to just run a program of every philosopher the last couple hundred years, there's a different way of spinning this. Right? Because Lacan's got exactly this picture of self-alienation. Right? The substance is also gone. Nietzsche's going to try and get rid of this whole thing. Active forgetfulness. He wants to go back to a notion of substance or whatever. You pick your... It's a really productive, I think, typography. That's the right word.
I think you can read Descartes' cogito really well.
Absolutely.
In that
Absolutely.
As soon as you begin to explain it, suddenly two egos appear, and suddenly it's this division at the core of self-recognition.
Yeah. What? And you go one of two ways, right? Descartes begins the meditations by withdrawing from the world. Right? So whatever the world of substance meant for Descartes, which was a world of war, right? He was a soldier in the 30 Years' War, and it's in the retreat from that war that he begins to reflect. Self-consciousness is a withdrawal from that world. Right? He's after that Archimedean point of certainty, but it ends up in maybe a situation of self-alienation and self-consciousness. Another way of going is, Spinoza. Just say, well, it's substance. Right? God or nature. And the understanding, rightly conceived, can unify with substance. And we can get round the problem that way. Right? That's the Hart-Negri temptation. It's powerful. You're deeply wrong. So it's an interesting map. And let's have a little break and then have some questions, and then I'll talk about Schelling. Oh, Catholic Shakespeare. I didn't talk about the Catholic Shakespeare. Let's do that when we start next time. First piece of evidence. Oldest so-called system-programmed German idealism. I gave you a copy of this yesterday. It was taken from the worldwide intraweb, which is the vehicle of the future happening right now. And there's, anyway, this text, but I've actually found the original version. I looked at my papers properly. But this text, written in not 1796, probably earlier than that, 1796 or so, represents and this is the internet, it's full of stupid mistakes. The tubing in 3, oh it's gone, it's all wrong. Alderlin. But the text is right. The ideas of Schelling in the mid-1790s. But this is it. You could read through the whole text, but this is the bit I want to pick out. So towards the bottom of the page, this page, about 8 lines up. Okay, there's stuff about the destroying the machine of the state and all of that. This is very radical, interesting text. It says, finally, the idea which unites all, the idea of beauty. The word taken in the higher Platonic sense. Oh God, this is so dumb, this text. It's full of mistakes. Taken in its higher Platonic sense. I convince that the highest act of reason, which, in that it comprises all ideas, is an aesthetic act. This is Schelling. Right? And that truth and goodness are united like sisters. That's also wrong. Our brothers. It's the German translation is wrong. Are brothers only in beauty. The philosopher must possess just as much aesthetic power as the poet. Okay. Then on the next page, we could look at, follow this through. 3 lines in. Poetry thereby obtains a higher dignity. It becomes again, in the end, these people were 20 when they're writing this. Schelling was 21 when he wrote this, more or less. It becomes again in the end what it was in the beginning. Teacher of history, the human race, humankind. Because there is no longer any philosophy, any history. Poetic art alone will outlive all the rest of the sciences. At the same time, we often hear that the great multitude should have a sensual religion or a sensuous religion. Sinnliche Religion or whatever. He goes on. First, I will speak about an idea here, which as far as I know has never occurred to anyone's mind. Again, he's 21. We must have a new mythology This mythology must, however, stand in the service ideas. It must be a mythology of reason. This is a fascinating text. But what it presents is the idea that the opposite of Hegel, that the completion of philosophy takes place in an aesthetic act. Right? So the this diagram is useful. Maybe we'll come back to that. I'm not normally good at diagrams, but I like that one. I was talking in the break, this is a parenthesis, that if we're thinking about Nietzsche, Nietzsche's genealogy of morals is the identification of this, right? And how do we get rid of this? Nietzsche urges practices of the love of fate, active forgetfulness, the overcoming of the human condition, desperate strategies for a desperate man. But the problem is analogous. But in relation to Schelling, so we've seen how in Hegel the problem of art is a thing of the past and needs to be overcome by philosophy. For Schelling, it's the other way around. This is stupid and abusive and patronising, but forgive me. Kant writes 3 critiques. First critique, second critique, and third critique. There are 3. First critique is to do with pure reason. It's the realm of truth, namely what can be known with certainty in a world that is explained by natural science. The second critique is concerned with practical reason, and it's concerned with the question of goodness, which for Kant is the question of the moral law. And Kant's ambition in the first critique, as he says in the preface to the first critique, is to draw tight the sphere of knowledge, what we can know, truth, knowledge, in order to make room for faith. And by faith he means the experience of practical reason and goodness. The third critique is a critique of aesthetic and teleological judgment. But for Kant, this is a stupid, limited way of doing it, but it's a heuristic and it might be helpful in illuminating this remark by Schelling. When Schelling says, truth and goodness are brothers only in beauty, the experience of art gives us the experience of beauty. The point being that the situation of philosophy in the after Kant was a situation of being in an amphibious position. Right? We live in a world which is explained by natural science, right? And over against that we have various moral beliefs. Okay? I should respect persons, that I should keep my promises and all the rest. The two things seem to be in wildly different universes. And how can those two things be harmonized, reconciled? The domain that is announced as a domain that's going to be the way in which those things are going to be reconciled is the domain of art and the experience of beauty. So truth and goodness are brothers only in beauty. It's like a summary of the entire Kantian system. So, when he says in that text that philosophers must acquire aesthetic sense, that's what he means. We need a sensual religion, right? So if religion is just, belief in some beyond, that won't do. It has to be here and now. Or we need to combine reason, rationality, with mythology, i.e. something that makes things concrete and alive. Right? That's the first piece of evidence. Second piece of evidence is this text, also by Schelling, from 1795. It's the year before, when he was even younger. so feel really bad at how little you've achieved in your lives. Seriously, I mean, Schelling got his professorship at the age of 23. It's called The Unconditional in Human Knowledge, Philosophical Letters on Dogmatism and Criticism. You've got that somewhere, right? Okay. Now, this text is, the importance of it cannot be understated. These were letters that Schelling wrote to nobody in particular, sort of open letters, imaginary letters. No, I won't set it up. Let's just go straight into it. It's better. Again, read this at your leisure if you get the chance. But the problem that Schelling is thinking through in his youth is what this experience of art and beauty might mean. And this is where the theme of the tragic is first introduced into the modern period. Right? Confirmation of that. You could look at Peter Zondi. I'm lifting this from Zondi, who might have been, was he Hammer's teacher? Peter Zondi? Great literary scholar in Berlin, who died in the 70s. Peter Zondi writes a book called Essay on the Tragic. Essay on the Tragic. Very important book, translated to English, and well translated a few years ago. S-Z-O-N-D-I. Peter Zondi. And Zondi's claim, which I'm plagiarizing here, is that there's a concept of the tragic that is fundamental to how we think about the last couple of hundred years in philosophy, literature, and all the rest. And that concept of the tragic is introduced on this page in 1795 by Schelling. Let's see how it goes. He's writing to nobody in particular. You're right. One thing remains to know that there is an objective power which threatens our freedom with annihilation. And with this firm and certain conviction in our hearts, to fight against it, exerting our whole freedom, and thus to go down. You are doubly right, my friend, because this possibility must be preserved for art, even after having vanished in the light of reason. It must be preserved for the highest in art. The problem here, which again might not be evident, is that if Copernicus is right, if the scientific revolution is right, and the world, the universe, is simply a set of causally determined networks, causal networks which determine our behaviour, where is freedom? Doesn't freedom just disappear? Right? That's the problem. If the scientific revolution is right, what happens to freedom? That's what is meant here by the objective world. I can't find my notes, so let's make it up. Many a time the question has been asked how Greek reason could bear the contradictions of Greek tragedy. This is where tragedy is introduced. A mortal, designed by fate to become a malefactor, he's thinking here of Oedipus, and himself fighting against this fate, is nevertheless appallingly punished for the crime, although it was the deed of destiny. Okay? Oedipus, destined by fate, the prophecy, to kill his father, sleep with his mother, but fighting against it, is punished for the crime. His wife dies, he puts out his eyes, although it was the deed of destiny. It's prophecy working its way through. The ground of this contradiction, and the contradiction here is between freedom and fate, that which made the contradiction bearable lay deeper than one would seek it. It lay in the contest between human freedom and the power of the objective world, in which the mortal must succumb necessarily if that power is superior. if it is fate. And yet he must be punished for succumbing because he did not succumb without a struggle. This is the important few sentences here. That the malefactor, Oedipus, who succumbed under the power of fate, was punished, this tragic fact was the recognition of human freedom. It was the honour due to freedom, Shelley says. Greek tragedy honoured human freedom, letting its hero fight against the superior power of fate. Right? So on this view so far, Greek tragedy is about fate having its way and the hero, Oedipus, fighting against that fate. And that this is the honour due to freedom. In order to go beyond the limits of art, the tragedy had to let him succumb. Nevertheless, in order to make restitution for this humiliation of human freedom extorted by art, it had to let him atone, even for the crime committed by fate. As long as he is still free, he holds out against the power of destiny. As soon as he succumbs, he ceases to be free. Right? As long as he's free, he holds out against fate. As long as he succumbs to fate, he ceases to be free. Succumbing, he still accuses fate for the loss of freedom. Even Greek tragedy could not reconcile freedom and failure. Only a being deprived of freedom could succumb under fate. This is the kicker. It was a sublime thought to suffer punishment willingly, even for an inevitable crime. And so to prove one's freedom by the very loss of this freedom, to go down with a declaration of free will. Here too, as in all instances, Greek art is standard, or it's the rule, regel. No people has been more faithful than the Greeks to the essence of humanity, even in art. In the last lines of the page there, what people are more natural than the Greeks, as long as Greek art remains within the limits of nature, yet as soon as it leaves those limits, what people are more terrible. The invisible power is too sublime to be bribed by adulation. Their heroes are too noble to be saved by cowardice. Is neglect, but to fight and fall. So, the question here about what is going to be the experience of art that's going to be able to hold together the experience of necessity and freedom. Freedom is the ethical sphere, and necessity is the realm explained by science, is going to be the tragic. So on this view, in terms of the architectonic here, it's not just that art is that sphere which can potentially, if not reconcile, then think together the things that Kant seems to have put apart, but the tragic becomes that domain. And why the tragic? Because the tragic allows us to think together freedom and fate. So the sublimity, and the word here is important. The sublimity of ancient tragedy consists in a hero, Oedipus, who accepts the power of necessity. Right? The world is explicable in, say, scientific terms, and his freedom consists in fighting with that and going down with a declaration of free will. So there's not a reconciliation here. There's a kind of battle, a kind of conflict, where the two things are held in a tension. And that's what Schelling says is the role of the tragic. Now, my notes are in peculiar disarray, because I guess there's just too many of them. Third piece of evidence, you have, do you not, I hope, pages from the construction of the forms of art. What do you have? Great. This is the way that thought is going to be picked up in. This is a book called The Philosophy of Art, which is also in the box from 1802-1803. The dates are unimportant, it's the argument I'm trying to pick out. Now, if you find the page 254, he begins to quote himself from this letter on dogmatism and criticism. And then he adds something to it. It's 255 that I want to read. And here the tone has changed slightly, importantly, but the argument is similar. Wherein this text, Philosophical Lesson on Dogmatism and Criticism, he talks about he says even Greek tragedy could not reconcile freedom and failure. This text 255. You got it? Yeah? He says the following. So I'll think through the thought and then we can let it go. The Greeks sought in their tragedy this kind of equilibrium between justice and humanity, necessity and freedom. A balance in which they could not satisfy their moral sensibility, just as the highest morality itself is expressed in this balance. Precisely this equilibrium is the ultimate concern of tragedy. It is not tragic that a premeditated free transgression is punished. Right? So if you do something, you steal some, peanuts from the store, and you're punished for it, that's not tragic. That a guiltless, guilty person unavoidably becomes increasingly guilty through fate itself is the greatest conceivable misfortune. But it's unfortunate, it's still not really tragic, right? You get cancer, you die, it's unfortunate, it's a real pity, it's not tragic. But that a guiltless, guilty person accepts punishment voluntarily, this is the sublimity of tragedy. Thereby alone does freedom transfigure itself into the highest identity with necessity. Tone here has changed. But the point here is that the sublimity of tragedy consists in a figure, and the figure here is Oedipus, who is, for Schelling, guiltless, right? He didn't do any wrong. He didn't knowingly do any wrong. But he accepts that he's guilty. He accepts that he is the person that killed his father and married his mother, and that's what the prophecy ordained. So the sublimity of tragedy consists in this idea of guiltless guilt. Guiltless guilt. The German there is schuldlose, so that he says that the Oedipus is dieser schuldlose Schuldige, this guiltless, guilty one. Interesting phrase. And this is what is sublime in tragedy. Last piece of evidence. That's the ancient world, and wasn't it terrific? Great, those Greeks. We love the Greeks. What about the modern world? This brings us to the question of the Catholic Shakespeare. This is 270 now on Schelling. 270. If ancient tragedy was capable of this harmonization of freedom and necessity, and this was its sublimity, what's going on in modern tragedy? And as you know, now this is not just a question about art, it's the question about the tragic is the placeholder for the unification of the totality of human knowledge, right? Has that role now. The tragic is the keystone in the arch of philosophy. Philosophy is the comprehension of the whole. So everything's going to turn on whether there can be tragedy or not, for Shelley. This is what he says. And of course the question comes up with regard to Shakespeare. Right? Our German friend Shakespeare. If we now summarise our findings, 270, bottom of the page, and express succinctly Shakespeare's relation to the sublimity of the tragedy of antiquity, we must call him the greatest creator of character. Hamlet, Richard III, Falstaff. He cannot portray that sublime, purified and transfigured beauty that proves itself in the face of fate, ancient tragedy, a beauty that coincides with moral goodness. The particular beauty that he does portray does not render such that it would appear as permeating the whole, and such that the work as a whole would carry its image or imprint. He knows the highest beauty only as individual character. Skipping over a couple of lines, antiquity possessed a concentrated universality, concrete universality, and viewed the allness or totality not in multiplicity but in unity. There is nothing human that Shakespeare did not touch upon, yet he touches it only individually, whereas antiquity touched it in its totality. The elements of human nature from the highest to the lowest lie dispersed within it. He knows it all. Every passion, every disposition, youth as well as age, the king and the shepherd. If our world were ever lost, one could recreate it from the series of his works. You could rebuild the modern world from Shakespeare. Whereas the ancient lyre enticed the whole world with 4 strings, the new instrument is 1,000 strings. It splits the harmony of the universe in order to create it, and for that reason, it's always less calming for the soul. So the question is that Shakespeare is the great inventor of character. Shakespearean tragedy is the tragedy of individuality. Right? So, can there be a Catholic Shakespeare? Means, can there be a Shakespeare who could unify that sense of self-consciousness, individuality, with a sense of community? Right? That's the project. And the philosophy of art of Schelling, 300 odd pages, basically peters out around that question. Can there be a Catholic Shakespeare? Because Shakespeare was, in the final analysis, too Protestant, too much of an individualist. Now, last piece of evidence, and then we can just open this up. This is page 280. This is where the book finishes. And you can feel here almost a desperation in Schelling. Can there be a Catholic Shakespeare? Let's hope so. He finishes on 280. I will remark only that the most perfect composition of all the arts, the unification of poesy is Dichtung in Germany, which is a wider range of meanings, so all forms of poetic creation, and music through song, poesy and painting through dance, both in turn synthesized together, is the most complex theatre manifestation, such as was the drama of antiquity. Only a caricature has remained for us, the opera. So here the opera is a caricature of the drama of antiquity. Italian opera, essentially, right? But maybe, I don't know if Schelling experienced Mozart, who knows? Which in a higher and nobler style, both from the side of poesy as well as from the other competed arts, might sooner guide us back to the performance of the ancient dialect combined with music and song. Music, song and dance, as well as the various types of drama, live only in public life and form an alliance in such life wherever public life disappears. And that's our situation. Public life is gone. Instead of that real external drama, which in all its forms an entire people participates as a political and moral totality. That's what Schelling wants. Only an inward, ideal drama can unite the people. This ideal drama is the worship service, Gottesdienst, right? Church service, the only kind of truly public action that has remained for the contemporary age, and even so only in an extremely diminished and reduced form. So the question of art, the Catholic Shakespeare, resolves itself into two possibilities, both of which are impoverished. Opera on the one hand, which looks like it's going to be the total artwork, but just gives it in the form of a sort of spectacle, and the church service, which in the experience of the church service, let's think, you take the Eucharist, and at that point you unify with the substance that is God in the life of the community, right? And the priest is transfigured at that moment, right? If you're a Catholic. Which is a great thought, I've always thought. Wonderful thought. But that is a diminished and reduced form. It doesn't exist within public life. It exists perhaps in the church. So how does one reconceive things? Well, the question is, can there be a Catholic Shakespeare? Can there be a Sophocles of the modern world? And final thing I will say, this is Nietzsche's question, right? Young Nietzsche has his love affair, virtual love affair with the older man Wagner, pins his hopes on Wagnerian opera, then goes through a long period of withdrawal from Wagner and opposition to Wagner in Nietzsche's late work, which for me is the most brilliant work. So he breaks with Wagner, and then what does he do? He wanders into the opera house in Nice, and by chance sees Bizet's Carmen. Right? Great, this is it. Right? Here's the Catholic Shakespeare. Here's the Sophocles of modernity. And he says there's a wonderful text called The Case of Wagner, which is almost the last thing Nietzsche wrote in his period of lucidity, before tertiary syphilis finally ravaged the boy's brain. He says, I've just seen Carmen for the 20th time, he says, so patient do I become, so happy, so Indian, so settled, to sit 5 hours, the first stage of holiness. He says, this music is cheerful, but not in a French or German way. Its cheerfulness is African. Fate hangs over it. And then he says in French, il faut méditerraniser la musique. We have to Mediterraneanize music. Right? Back with the love affair with the South. Right? The sickness here is deep, right? Anything Mediterranean, Indian, African will allow us to restore ourselves to health. Right? Some Catholic Shakespeare, world music, anything. God, just please save us with something. I exaggerate, but you get, so Hegel on the one side, the experience of art requires philosophy. Schelling on the other side, the experience of the problem that philosophy poses culminates in the possibility of art, tragic art. And then the question then becomes, where is the tragedy of the modern world? How can that be thought? And I think that it's a dysoilogoid, it's an antinomy. Right? We have a problem here. How we think the relationship between philosophy and art, philosophy and poetry. So,
antinomian crisis.
Antinomian crisis. And, we can, again, if you look at, you could think about what I'm trying to do this morning a little bit as mapping, right? This is a way of mapping out. We can think about different thinkers in the last couple of hundred years as choosing, moving one way or the other in relationship to this map, right? Which way you're going to go. So I've talked far too much, so let's have some discussion. Then we have to make a decision about what we're going to do this afternoon. There were questions during the break, so don't be bashful. I heard you.
I've been ruminating over the last day or so about your question of where can we find tragedy today?
Right.
And it seems like a couple answers might be acts of public civil disobedience. So like Bradley Manning is both innocent and guilty, or there's two systems of justice in conflict where he's clearly on the side of justice, he's clearly on the side of democracy, yet at the same time,
Remind us all of the Bradley Manning case, because not everybody will know
so
the context.
He's the man who's been accused of leaking all of the material to WikiLeaks.
Right.
And he deserves a small measure of credit for sparking the revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt and elsewhere in North Africa and the Middle East. Probably he deserves a larger measure of credit than any other American, I would say, for spreading democracy in the Middle East. And so if our society has this value, we should spread democracy. He's clearly faithful to that desire.
Yeah.
Yet he violated the law. If what he's accused of doing is correct, he clearly violated the law.
Mm-hmm.
And so what's missing from this is fate, I think. Like this
Fate.
I maybe if I'm not sure how fate fits in here, that in Schelling's formulation, you're the guiltless guilty one in part because you didn't make a choice. Fate, or your choice and fate coincided somehow.
Okay.
And then another recent example is
We can think about Assange too in that, couldn't we?
yeah, and Assange's
In fate, I mean, I don't want to interrupt, just to insert something, would be to say, well, Napoleon's remark to Goethe, right, that what fate was in the modern world, what fate was in the ancient world, politics is in the modern world. So you say the role of fate is the role of the political regime. Let's say in this case, the example of Swedish law, or the Swedish state, if Assange is extradited and tried in Sweden, for example. So that would be one place where fate might be.
Yeah, I like that answer. And then, Assange is, I think, a really interesting figure for studying questions of sovereignty, because
Yes.
his driving ethic is transparency.
Yes.
Yet in order to make WikiLeaks function, he has to, in some ways, ape the CIA. That WikiLeaks has to be a kind of conspiracy, a kind of you have to really guard the secrets, and he's been really militant about, in some cases, almost ridiculously cracking down, like trying to copyright the things that WikiLeaks releases.
Yeah.
And so there's this odd dynamic where I'm fully 100% with Assange, but that he's there is this mimetic rivalry with something like the state or the
Precisely. It's like Antigone and Crown, right?
Right.
They double each other, but they both have within themselves that portion of the other that they're opposing, right? There's a replication of structures here, which is fascinating, and vice versa. The CIA, by virtue of that dialectical logic, have also got something of Assange in them.
Right.
Right. They can't just say they're the bad guys. It's not.
Right, but the CIA
Never that
is what
straightforward.
defends democracy, and because we need to defend democracy, we create the most anti-democratic institution in the history of the universe. Maybe that's too far, but it's a very anti-democratic institution.
For the last 7 years, let's say, 50 years.
I would say since the beginning, right? I mean, and the
Beginning
FBI
of
as
time.
well.
All right.
But and then the other place where I might say the tragedy exists in in contemporary
I think that's
culture
right. I agree with that. I think it's a very deep point. We might want to discuss that, but yeah.
is true crime, like the Menendez brothers.
Right.
Is it just to murder your parents if your parents abused you ruthlessly
All right.
their whole life?
Remind us of the case.
So and I don't really remember. I was younger when this happened, but the Menendez brothers murdered their father or both of their parents. I don't remember.
Who knows the details of the case?
They murdered their parents, and then it was
And
unclear.
where was this? This was in.
LA, maybe?
California.
California.
It was in Beverly Hills.
You know,
Wealthy family, and they resented their parents and wanted the money for themselves. And I think they thought the father was draconian, so they murdered him so they could get all the money and do whatever they wanted.
And the funny thing is that the father was in the entertainment industry, and he managed all these boy bands. He managed Ricky Martin's boy band. I don't know what it was called.
Menudo.
And there were other ones too.
Well, that's right. We win the pop trivia prize this morning. That's right.
Be on our pub quiz.
And so
That was fast.
the Menendez family is a kind of nobility, and if
Yes.
celebrity culture is what counts as nobility today. And so then there's this question of, was this motivated by money, or the claim was made that the children had been sexually abused repeatedly, and that this was something more like a way of surviving, a self-defense. We can't do anything else, but in that sense, it might be faith more in the traditional sense. Like
Yeah.
Although there was also an argument that they made up that defense.
right. So it's unclear, but it allows our society to sort of draw a line. That we've got this morally ambiguous situation, and now somehow we've got to draw a line. Are they guilty? Are they innocent? And
I think they're both very, very interesting examples,
Can I ask a
and they
question?
illuminate this very well.
Yeah, related, which is precisely on this, which is to relate it back to the sort of theory or the philosophy that we've been talking about, and something that sort of was implicit, and I would like to make it explicit now. And it's a question rather than a statement, actually. The relationship between a materialism and an idealism in this. In that we were talking, the most obvious point when we were talking with this transition, if it is a transition from Hegel to Marx,
Yeah.
of what the stakes are and where the tragedy lies. This is the transition point from the idealism to the materialism. If you, I'm not trying to make Hegel simply the idealist or Marx simply the materialist, but you see what I'm getting at, the general movement.
Yeah.
That this is this transposition of the tragic into the material. That this is Marx's illumination. That the proletarian position is the tragic position. This war position, this position, that position in the material lived experience is the tragic.
Isn't that where Marx said he turned Hegel on his head?
Yeah. I mean, it depends. That's what he put. What does he actually say? He says that he put Marx the right way up.
The right way up.
Marx Hegel the right way
Is
up.
it Engels who said it, or is it him? I can't remember now.
Marx does say something like that, but it's reversing or putting up Engels to. I'm not such a stickler for the distinction between idealism and materialism.
Okay.
And I'm not such a. I mean, materialism is like one of these things that's introduced into arguments like a trump card, which, oh wow, materialism. Stuff in the world, that's right, okay. Idealism, bad, materialism, good. I don't buy that at all. And particularly the sort of, what would be the most polite thing to say on camera?
we could turn it off for a minute.
The transcendental illusions of Deleuzean materialism, which heats up heads, as Hegel would say, without doing much else. And you think you're talking about it just seems completely idealistic to me. Right? But what does Marx mean by materialism? He doesn't mean stuff, he doesn't mean matter, right? Marx writes this brilliant thesis criticising Democritus and Epicurus, right? And he criticises the 18th century materialist tradition. If you've got materialism as, you know, atoms and all that stuff, that's what the French were up to in the 18th century. Marxist materialism is materialism of praxis, right? Praxis, and that's what philosophy has to become. Hegel's idealism is an idealism of praxis, right? And the concept is praxis comprehended in its historical movement. We think of it that way. Hegel and Marx are two sides of the same coin, which is how someone like, you know, there's a tradition of left Hegelianism through people like Lukács, which would go with that theory. So there are differences, right? I mean, Marx, for me, takes the dialectical, it's not a method, the dialectical way of thinking. He does what Hegel doesn't do, although it's, you know, Hegel was aware of this, but, you know, it means that the philosophical task has to be the comprehension of praxis in its unfree unfolding, right? In the modern world, in the regime of capital, right? So the philosophical discipline then becomes, how do we comprehend those the mechanisms that govern that operation? And then we get, you know, the various formulae of Capital One and commodity fascism and all the rest, and, you know, we get, but it seems to me that could be understood as a Hegelian set of insights. They're not ones that Hegel himself did, right, for various reasons we could discuss, but it's not as if there's a radical break, I don't think.
Well, I guess what I was, I'm sorry, I just wanted to, problem is that we can't use the idealism materialism distinction there.
Yeah, I think it's a frozen and unhelpful. It's a sort of, yeah. I don't think it really does much.
Okay, I'll try some different words then. Sophistry. In that we're dealing with these plays, which you're saying are speaking about the city, the antagonisms and contradictions within the polis, which then become expressed through these performative entities, these theatrical entities. Yet we've just been talking about, there's a performative element certainly, but actual, you know, people in jail, the actual contradictions of society. Right,
the distinction between the theatrical and the actual.
Yeah.
Okay.
Between the presentation of it and the.
That's not analogous to the materialism idealism distinction necessarily, but I've got questions about that.
I'm not saying that for the Assange thing is not theatrical.
Yeah.
In this media-driven, etc. realm, of course, there's a theatre to it, a theatre of state power and America being seen to be doing something about them.
And there'll be a theatre of law.
Yeah.
And law is a theatre, and theatre is a.
So then, do we just have life as a stage and we're all actors?
I think someone said that.
Some German guy.
Some German guy. Some German.
Calderón de la Barca, Spanish.
Huh?
Calderón de la Barca was the one who said that.
Who said that, sir?
Calderón de la Barca.
Calderón. Ah, well, Calderón.
Spanish,
well,
theater.
you see, the Catholic, the hope that's held out at the end of the Schelling reading for a Catholic Shakespeare turns on Calderón. We could talk about Calderón, but yeah. But Shakespeare, which character says that in Shakespeare?
All life's a stage.
One of them does. But the theatrical and the actual, I'm not so sure. I mean, yeah, sure, there's a different. I'm not saying that all you know, that we live in that there isn't real suffering in the real world and actual. Sure, I'm not going to deny it. That would be stupid.
I'm not trying to make a massive distinction, I'm trying to make a relation between or trying to ask about why the representation pops up when again, are we that different from the Greeks? They're making a representation. Are they making a representation because they can't deal with these contradictions, and the contradictions are just repressed, so then they have to make this cathartic
We don't know, but maybe.
fantasy?
Yeah.
Do they not see the contradictions in their society like we see the contradictions, but yet we represent them anyway with the wire, but yet the contradictions themselves are already theatrical?
Mm-hmm.
There's this constant kind of redoubling of theatres.
Yeah. I think
This is it. I'm just trying to work through different relations.
well, no, I think yes to all of that. It doesn't mean that the actual disappears. It means that, the limit between the theatrical and the actual is porous and difficult to pin down.
Isn't this kind of where Beauregard goes later?
Well, if you like.
I mean, doesn't he get to
It's not, but to call it a simulacrum or
not a
it's not-
simulacrum or a hyperreal, but that the real itself is doubling itself to the point of entering.
Yeah, but the point is that they got that 2,500
Of
years
course,
ago.
of course.
Yeah?
I mean, it's not that we're getting anywhere different.
We don't need Las Vegas for that.
Yeah,
We don't need Las Vegas, which is a great place.
but I think
Go on through.
I was interested. It was interesting to see when you said you don't have a huge problem with dividing idealism and materialism.
In the Hegel-Marx
Right.
opposition, yeah, because for Marx, the materialism of praxis, and for Hegel, idealism is an idealism of praxis. They've got the same object, same thing in mind.
I lost my thought here, but
Go on.
I feel like is there a necessity to as you were trying to, I think, flesh out in your work, is to reestablish how to think the tragic today,
Mm-hmm.
but as philosophy's duty, and perhaps philosophy in the form of tragedy in the Greek times, which was a sort of practice, philosophy of bringing back theory and practice with philosophical method.
Well, it's not. It doesn't even require. Yeah, yes, I agree, but I think the examples that Thomas brought up show that this is happening. Right. It doesn't. It requires the smallest tweaking to see how we could think about the Assange case in Sophoclean terms. The smallest, just movement of the object. Okay, it's like that. So it's operational. These structures are.
But so what does the philosopher think politically in regards to the Assange case?
Don't know. I don't really, in a sense, I don't really care. I don't know who the philosopher is.
Yeah, sure.
I don't think that philosophy is sort of some sort of queen of the sciences that can sort of download its concepts into the world.
Right.
Although a lot of people
Right.
expect that. It's a disaster. That's what we're trying to wake up from. I think. It's, that if we're interested in really in the relation between theory and practice,
Right.
then we have to start off from, I think, abandoning that.
Right.
I think Platonist assumption. So for me, the great thing about and why I'm against the future is that with the slightest, spend some time with these tragedies, you get a vocabulary for thinking through what's happening, which is incredibly powerful, right? And it also, there's that. Rebecca wants to come in. We want to follow up.
I just wonder. I mean, you said you're against the future.
Yes, I'm being polemical, but
Okay. But
against the future, the way Benjamin's against the future.
Okay,
in philosophy.
that's what I was thinking.
We should face this way. Not ideology. Ideology is always future orientated.
Right.
Capitalism is about the reproduction of novelty.
Right.
Capitalism is always concerned with the future, if you like, in those terms.
But are you kind of along the lines of Derrida's concept of le futur et l'avenir.
Right, but he says the l'avenir is what's happening now, right? He understands the avenir as the fracturing of the present by this experience of the messianic in the Spectres of Mark's book. So that I'm happy with. And it becomes, I mean, you know, my point is very simple. It's that, you know, we live in societies which reproduce amnesia for the purpose of the reproduction of systems of power. It's very simple. Therefore, the most radical thing one can do is to have some historical sensibility. I remember as a student back at the University of Essex, when we were all very keen on the Sandinista in the 80s, listening to the Clash and whatever. It was there was this Sandinista poster we had in the student union, which was something like, you know, we are free because we possess our history. Right? So the condition of possibility, the transcendental condition of possibility for freedom is historical sensibility. So for me, the most radical thing one can do is acquire historical sense. I mean, it's a very banal thought, right? It's a very banal thought, but that would mean that I think we would maybe think a little bit differently when certain things are articulated and expressed, and not get sucked into certain delusions. You know, a newspaper calls you up and say, you know, what do you think is going to be the trend of the next 10 years? You say, fuck off. You know, read Homour every year. How about that? How about that for a start? You know, 2 stories, love and war. Seems that we're still there, you know? People tearing each other to pieces in the name of war, which is a criminal act, and love, which continually is moved to the side with the question of infidelity. That would do, you know. Can we just tell you what gadgets are gonna, you know, and then I think as thinkers we have to sort of refuse that seduction, because it is an ideological seduction. I guess that's why Slavoj, I think, is, you know, I'm down with Slavoj, because that is, I think, part of what he's up to, right? The issue in the face of this, you know, endlessly accelerated present, where, you know, it's speed and fast and connection. We're all nomads, and, you know, what do we do? Well, how about doing nothing, right? How about staying put and thinking for a while? And the idea that the nomadic is radical just strikes me as bewildering. There's nothing radical about the nomadic. Nomadic seems to me to be an ideological position, right? Essentially, it's the position of the entrepreneur, right? I remember reading a great book by Tom Peters, Liberation Management. I used to read a lot of management literature, because it's you know, because you see how, because we might think of those people as somehow, oh, they're dumb or whatever, but actually they're using very similar concepts in management theory to, you know, and Deleuze has made a big impact, and Nietzsche, and someone like Tom Peters in his very sort of, you know, guyish way is saying, you know, it's a world of chaos and contingency and uncertainty, and the entrepreneur has to be that nomadic individual that goes into a location, into a locality, and creates value, and creates wealth, and then moves on. Right? There's your nomad. That's what apparently Edward Said is saying is the radical position. I don't know. I'm ranting again.
Isn't there also, I mean, Berlioz' position would be that the culture today and globalization is forcing people into nomadic lifestyles.
Yes.
And so in that regard,
So yes.
It's a different type of nomad. It's not one of,
I mean, you know, the people that cook my breakfast in the morning are nomads, right? From Pueblo, but they're not choosing to be in Brooklyn, you know. But they're nomadic. I mean, you have to recognise that sociologically, economically, as this is a situation, you know, this is, you know, it's not so new. I mean, Marx had this category of dislocation. I mean, what capital does is it produces dislocations. It does. The main dislocation is a dislocation from the country to the city, right? I mean, hello. I mean, urbanisation is. It goes back to the 12th century. I mean, the Flemish weaving towns were urbanising. That's, I mean, the idea that we're on the brink of some transition is just, it's just fabulous. It's a form of, it's only explicable as a form of amnesia, right? People have always been nomadic. There's an urbanite. I mean, what am I talking about? I'm getting heated now. You've been trying to get in.
No, I have a phone in my hand.
Really? Okay, that's what you were making hand signals.
No. But now that, I have a question.
You're going to tell me about purse now, aren't you?
Later on maybe.
All right.
But yeah, purses. I have a question. If we would think of a Christian, a Catholic Shakespeare, it's from Hegel's more or less point of view, or at least from that perspective. But what happens if we go back to Christ? Jesus Christ, is he a tragic character, a figure? Could we consider it? Because there's a big discussion on that precisely part of the problem of the Catholic religion, or the Christian religion, is that he was never tragic. If he had been tragic, probably the religion could have understood our being better. And I'm uniting. I want you to explain that. But also, I related to the.
How long have you got? I've got views on this gentleman, Jesus Christ.
But let me ask the second question, which is
he's always been my role model.
But also the concept of the symbol of nomadism, or being nomadic, is so Christian. I mean, that's
absolutely.
The whole idea.
Paul is
So
nomadic.
then,
The early Christians are nomadic.
Because I think that there's a big ideology behind that.
They're nomadic in a different imperial context, right? The imperial context is Rome and its legal, political regime and economic regime as well, and that produces a form of nomadism, anyway, we know that story. I could say so much about Christ. I mean, it could be understood as a tragedy. People have understood it as a tragedy. I wouldn't know where to start and end, to be honest. No, if I start, it won't stop, because it's just.
Do you think he fulfills in whatever way of the myth of what happened a tragic figure, or doesn't fulfill it?
A fool. I think a fool. So the idea of Christ as the divine fool, I think it's very attractive.
But he never feels guilty for anything.
Christ is God.
Okay.
What's he got to feel guilty about?
But
There's this
then
there's this debate we had in January, and there was this wonderful moment when someone asked, I was at Cornell West, and someone asked Cornell, he said something about Christianity, and someone said this really smart question. So you think Christ was a philosopher then? She said, no, Christ was God.
Well, the first Hegel, if you stop to think about it, Judas is okay. We needed Judas is basically what Christ is saying, or the words that we put in Christ.
Yeah.
And then the idea of the fortunate fall. I mean, it's liberating. So evil creates goodness.
Mm-hmm.
It's at work creating goodness.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's amazing in terms of the paradox of that.
Well, I understand that Werner is doing Milton, right? I mean, Milton's genius is to have sort of fused those elements of classical epic and tragedy with the Christian narrative, right? So it's the curse that works through it is the curse of original sin, the curse of the fall, the sin of Adam, which Christ will redeem, right? Save us from.
But then, where's freedom?
Where's freedom? Well, freedom is the capacity for error, right? In a Christian view. That's what's so odd about contemporary Christianity. The idea that Christianity is interested in freedom. Christianity is the opposite of freedom. Freedom is the capacity for sin, and the Christian has to hone their soul towards that which, in a sense, has to freely. So freedom becomes the orientation of the soul towards the possible dispensation of the grace of God, right? But the idea that Christianity is somehow consistent with freedom as a voluntaristic choosing of different options is clearly theologically nonsense. Christianity is about the restraining of freedom, right? Freedom is what the Romans had. That's paganism.
The freedom in Christianity is to discover what apparently God wants of us.
Well, we'll see.
Which is
We'll find out.
Well, it's
Rebecca,
possible.
Rebecca was going to you had your hand up.
Yeah, it's kind of far past now, but it was just
Okay,
a
take us
simple
back.
insight into what Thomas was talking about and just what something we were talking about yesterday too. The guiltless guilty one is just made me think about the state of exception.
Mm-hmm. How does it do that?
Well, there's this writer I really like called Sharon Razak, and she applies state of exception to the refugee.
Right.
And I think that's a good example of it.
Mhm.
To add on to Thomas's examples.
Oh yeah. Yes. I mean a figure we've not talked about in relation to tragedy, but it's on my mind, is the figure of the refugee, the figure of the immigrant, the figure of the foreigner. We talk about foreign women, but a real issue in tragedy that's been worked through in tragedy is what you do with refugees. And Oedipus at Colonus, Oedipus turns up as a refugee from Thebes in Athens, and he's blind. He's with Antigone, and who are you? And they say, I'm Oedipus. So you're that. You're not welcome around here. Get out of here. So let me stay. I'm tired. And then the king comes, Theseus, and eventually he's given refuge and allowed to die in the city of Athens. So a key thing in tragedy is hospitality to the refugee, and the tension between the native and the foreigner. So we could think about that in very very contemporary ways.
And the complication of the native being the colonizer too, so it's in the neighbor.
Yeah. It's again, what's so odd about Greek tragedy is one of the things it speaks to is if Greek tragedy had been the sort of official ideology of the city-state in a fairly uncomplicated way, it would be much easier to understand. What's so difficult to understand is how there are all these complications in it, namely that you find repeatedly in tragedy this issue of how do we deal with the foreigner, and how do we extend hospitality to the foreigner. And it becomes this question of, as we saw it yesterday in the Oresteia, that if we take the standard view of the Oresteia, the just city is the city that welcomes as its protector the metic, right? The foreigner. Right? That's the role that the Furies assume. There's kind of a lesson in that, not kind of a lesson, there is a lesson. And I gave a talk in Athens in November in relationship to this question. And the thing about Athens now is that Athens has become the first staging post for entry into the European Union. Athens is full of foreigners, right? And there's an awful lot of racism in Greece, and most of those foreigners are foreigners who are displaced by war, right? So there's a huge amount of Iraqi refugees who wound up in central Athens. So you've got this scenario playing itself out repeatedly, and then the usual response to that is that we need to limit immigration, control immigration, stem the flow, whatever. These are debates that, yeah. So yeah, that's a very good example. The sheep's got a question. 3 bells. Any last thoughts?